Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. I wanted to remind everybody to please upload a photo to your iLearn profile. See, I've already done that. Well, that's not quite a photo. It's a cartoon image of me working from home. So that's fine too. But you see here on the left, students, when they upload a profile, you actually have a face next to your name, which is really nice when we read each other's post in the forum. So please do that. You just have to go to your profile in the right hand corner when you open iLearn, click that arrow, it gives you a dashboard, click profile, upload image, and you're done. All right, so where had we left off last week? I had left you with that assignment, right, to write a critical response to that historical overview that you all read, and I had left you with a bunch of questions, and I told you to choose 2 or 3 of those, and I really enjoyed reading your responses. So let's recap a little bit. For the first question, right, this intriguing question of what do we mean by China and by the West, I think a lot of you did a really nice job at teasing out that difference between a political definition or a geographical definition, that might orient itself by the borders of a country or territory, and a more cultural definition that in the case of China hinges very much on dynastic changes. It hinges on who rules the country, whether it's a Han rule or a non-Han rule. We'll be talking much more about that this week when we talk about the Mongols. And of course the same goes for the West. Right? A lot of you pointed out that it hadn't occurred to you that the West, in the context of our class or the first part of the class, really was only Europe, right? And not America or Australia or other places. But of course, even in Europe, right, if we think of it as a geographical entity or political entity, borders have changed over time. And again, we'll be talking about that today, that especially in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, during the conflict with the Arab world, large parts of Europe, the West, were sometimes ruled by Arab caliphates. So it's not quite as clear-cut as we always think. And then, of course, also in the European context, or in the Western context, we have that religious or cultural category, right, that might define the territory. Again, more about that today. Why and when did Westerners travel to China, right? You all, I think, pointed out the idea of commerce being really important. Religion in the case, especially when we get, to the Jesuits and when we get to the 18th, 19th, 20th century. As for why Chinese people came to the West, right? So, again, we already mentioned those treasure ships by Zheng He. We'll be talking about those in a couple of weeks, right? Very much a display of Chinese civilization. Of course, also interest in cultural change. Let's see, there were 2 more questions I wanted to spend just a minute discussing with you. Number 5, to what degree can past encounters help us make sense of Sino-Western relations today? And a lot of you picked that question, and you all did a really fabulous job. One of you, I wanted to read out that post. I thought that was particularly interesting. Past encounters can give us a frame of reference in regards to the positions of both the West and modern China today. It helps us understand that today's situation is not static, but is continuously changing at a much more rapid pace than we can realistically understand. Even if we can't predict the future with 100% accuracy, we can observe recurring patterns in the past and we draw meaning from them. Excellent. That was really a really good response. And I like that, the student also drew on the text itself by Mongello, right? There's that quote from page 12. And then I replied and I said, oh, great response. I really like what you say about the nature of Sino-Western relations. Yes, they are changing all the time. And while the past might not necessarily help us predict the future, knowing the past will certainly help us better understand the other's perspective. So this is really one of the key points that I want to drive home in our class, and that we have to remind ourselves over and over throughout this semester. And then number 6, is there any information in the text about China or the West that surprised you? And a lot of you, I think, pointed out that, well, you were a little surprised that Europe was sort of, or the West was essentially, equated to Europe or vice versa, right? That Europe was really the West. And also that there were times in European history when Europe didn't really compare in any way to China in terms of its territory, military might, importance as a trading nation, right? Somebody quoted that in 1453, Europe was at its nadir, at its lowest point, arguably. And then somebody quoted again Mungello here, by standard criteria such as size, population, agriculture, commerce, wealth, sophistication, technology, military might, cuisine, learning, literature, and the fine arts, the Ming Dynasty, right, 14th, 15th, 16th century, presided over the greatest nation in the world, right? That for so much of world history, China or Chinese civilization was the preeminent civilization on the globe. And that's, of course, in a way where we also want to pick up today. One word about why I always want you to work closely with the text. You've probably seen that in our iLearn site, at the very top there is a tab that says Writing Resources, and there's a couple of files in there. One of them is called Using Sources. If you're relatively new to academic writing, I encourage you to check that out. But I also want to throw this question at you right now. Why do we have to use sources? Why is that so important? And, there's probably 3 really important reasons. One is to win your audience's trust, right? You can say anything you want, but unless you provide the evidence, right, nobody's going to believe you. Readers expect accuracy, right? When you read a historical source, even if you read a newspaper, right, you want to be able to believe the author, right? So you as the audience, you as the reader, you would like people to cite their sources, to tell you where that knowledge, where that information came from, right? And of course, readers, or we, all of us in the academic community, we expect careful attribution, right? Of course, it's a scholarly convention. It's also courtesy, right? We know that you don't just take other people's ideas without giving them credit for that. And, one thing that this text using sources does, it shows you different ways of citing a source. And I've given a few examples here, essentially all of the same. According to Mungello, during the period between 15 and 1800, the flow of influence between China and the West fluctuated quite dramatically. And then just page number in brackets. And the information here is probably paraphrased, right, according to Mungello. So we actually have the reference there, but it's probably not verbatim. It's probably not word for word. It's somewhat paraphrased. Still, we have to attribute it. Some scholars believe that during the period between 15 and 1800, the flow of influence between China and the West was rarely constant, but fluctuated quite dramatically. Some scholars believe that during the period between 15 and 1800, the flow of influence between China and the West was rarely constant, but fluctuated quite dramatically. Mungello, 2005, 9. So if you look at the brackets, the difference between these two really is just how it's cited, right? The first one just gives the name of the author and the page number. The second one gives the author and the year of publication and the page number. So there are different conventions. The most important thing is always consistency. If you want to choose one way, stick with it throughout. So please check out that Using Sources article and have a look. And while we are talking about resources, I want to point out one more time for you the Tutoring and Academic Support Center, TASC or TASC, that provides really useful support, writing support, or just academic support. And if you would like help with anything, why don't you check them out? They have open office hours. You can make appointments. Check out their website. There's also a link on the iLearn site. But now we want to spend some time in the company of Marco Polo. You've already seen this image last week, right? And I think I told you that I like to use stamps. Why do I like to use stamps? If you want to see if a person is important, check if he or she made it onto a stamp. That's usually a good indication. So, who is Marco Polo? I'm sure you've all heard of him. This stamp was made at occasion of the 400th anniversary, right, in 1954. So he was born in 1254 in the Republic of Venice at a time when Venice was a republic, when it wasn't part of the modern nation-state of Italy yet. And he was born into a wealthy family of merchants. And his father and uncle, Niccolo and Maffeo, were both traders. And their main base was actually in Constantinople. We'll look at a map in a minute. And in 1260, the two of them already went on an extended trading mission that took them all the way to Mongolia, to the court of Kublai Khan. And in 1269, the two of them returned to Venice, fetched young Marco, who wasn't even 20 at the time yet, and the three of them set off for Asia on the series of adventures that Marco Polo later documented in his famous book, and from which we will read some extracts this week. Now, let's look at a map of Europe and the Middle East quickly, and remind ourselves of the political situation in Europe at the time. Now, from the 9th until the mid-13th century, the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate ruled from Baghdad, it's right here, over most of the Middle East, North Africa, and even parts of Europe, right? The Iberian Peninsula, Spain, right? All of that was under Muslim control. And only Constantinople, right here, we call Istanbul today, right? Only Constantinople, the capital of the remaining eastern rump of the Roman Empire, survived as a Christian terminus of the spice and silk caravans from the east. And they traveled along that fabled Silk Road, Sichuan Zhilu. You might have heard of that term, the Silk Road. It's again being used a lot these days. And the Silk Road was really a connection of trading routes that connected essentially Europe with as far away places as China. And you see here in red, this is the overland Silk Road. It goes right through Central Asia, right, Afghanistan, and then it connects here in blue with the trading routes along the Mediterranean. And then there was also a maritime trade route in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and we'll also talk about that at some point. How does Marco Polo fit into all of that? We already know that he is from Venice, right, up here in what is today northern Italy. Now, during the 10th century, Italian trading cities, such as Venice, began to develop navies to counter Muslim raiders and pirates. You remember that at that time, Muslim caliphates ruled over much of the Middle East and territories close to the Mediterranean. Now, similar to maritime republics of antiquity, you might have studied about those in history, like Athens or Carthage, a wealthy merchant class collectively held power in the Republic of Venice. Precisely people like the Polos. Now, the reason why Venice became so fabulously wealthy and important, and you can see here in blue, actually controlled quite a lot of territory in the Mediterranean, is because in exchange for shipping crusaders to the Holy Land during the Fourth Crusade, at the beginning of the 13th century, with their newly built navy, Venice was given exclusive trading rights, tax privileges, and in some instances even territorial control of strategic trading posts. So, this is something really interesting. You'll see that so much of world history, that we might associate with religious or geostrategic conflict, often is actually very closely linked to commerce and trade. While we have all these fabulous maps at our disposal now, how about Marco Polo? Well, here is a map that somebody like Marco Polo would have had at his disposal. That's a map of the world, by the way, 1235. You see, most of the classical knowledge of the world had been forgotten or lost in Europe by the 13th century. And, cut off from much of Asia or the rest of the world, Western Christendom reimagined Asia in its own image. Jerusalem, at this map of the world, is placed very much at the center. So this is a Judeo-Christian centric map. And only sparse knowledge of China, that was sort of known as the originator of silk, this mythical place way out there was known. But really very little was known of East or South Asia in medieval Europe. On the other hand, Muslim scholars and cartographers had an astonishingly accurate knowledge of the known world. So here is a map that's actually earlier than the one I just showed you, almost 100 years earlier, the Tabula Rogeriana, drawn by the Muslim geographer Al-Idrisi for Roger II of Sicily in 1154, which is one of the most advanced medieval world maps. So this is one that's actually adjusted. It's shown upside down as the original, at the south at the top. And maybe some of you might wonder, how come we have a Muslim geographer in Sicily that was ruled by the Normans at the time? Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that, but if you're curious, I recommend a wonderful novel to you by Tariq Ali, and it's called A Sultan in Palermo. Maybe put it on your reading list for your Thanksgiving break reading. Okay, we're almost at the end of our first lecture, and in our second lecture, we're going to explore some more questions, and those are, where were the Polos actually headed if they didn't even have a map, if they didn't even know what was beyond Constantinople or the places they usually travel to? And what did people call the land to the far east where the silk was said to originate from? And why is the answer to this question so relevant to our class on China in the West? And I'll leave you with this beautiful 1374 depiction of Marco Polo's caravan traveling across Asia. And I will see you shortly.